Hi everyone, it's Will. This is the Grand Duke Dmitri Diary Series, 1921, March 1921. And I just came in from outside. It's a cold January day and I'm still a little bit chilly, so forgive me for keeping my outdoor apparel on for the moment. I thought if any of you are curious, I would just mention that that is a boxed print behind me. It's a very inexpensive one. It honestly is just a page that was taken out of a book on theater. It's an opera backdrop, and sold as a print in London. But I've always liked it, even though it's just a cheap thing. But Dmitri personally found boxed. He lurid, I think, was the word he used. He didn't like the colors that boxed used, and he thought it was a little. Well, yeah, lurid. That was his word. Anyway, this doesn't strike me as lurid, but there you go. I'm not sure which opera he saw. Okay, so, yes, before I forget, I wanted to mention this book, which I expressed great enthusiasm about when I first got it, The Russian Roots of Nazism, White Emigres in the Making of National Socialism, 1917 and 1945, by Michael Kellogg, who got his PhD at UCLA, although the book is published by Cambridge University Press. And I have to say, I'm a little bit disappointed because I just can't, I just don't think that Michael Kellogg has sold his thesis to me. The thesis being that white Russians of the type of these people that Dmitri has been meeting, Biskupsky and Markov et al., that they were so influential that they're really at the root of the formation of Nazism in Germany. And I just don't see it, having read, I haven't quite finished the book yet, but so far he just hasn't sold me that these men, not that they weren't, what he says they were as far as being Nazi supporters, but they just weren't that important. They just weren't that influential. But anyway, it's a good book to have in your library if you're interested in these things because of the bibliography and the notes, which are very solid. So when he says something that I find unlikely, I can look at exactly what his source was for that and then make my own decision about whether that source is as reliable as he seems to be saying or not. So anyway, that's that. Now for a recap. Yesterday we did the 2nd of March 1921. Today we're doing the 3rd, but on the 2nd, so we had 4 women. Audrey Parr has now exited the scene, taken the train out of Berlin. Vera Karali, Dmitri's former lover from Russia and then from London, has entered the scene. And off stage, we have Gugi, Marie-Louise, and Lady Marling that Dmitri wrote letters to, both of them. Okay, we have from yesterday Golievsky's concern about security, the man who was acting as Dmitri's adjutant. He was very concerned about Dmitri's security in Berlin because of the Bolshevik presence there. But as far as I can see, the German Bolsheviks weren't, or communists weren't interested in Dmitri. And if there were Russian Bolsheviks there, they were also not interested in Dmitri, I think. So anyway, Dmitri went to a tea given by the Russian National Assembly, which was a group, and he received an extremely enthusiastic reception with all kinds of welcoming speeches, and in return he gave a fairly cautious speech in which he thanked them in the name of the entire imperial family and had already stipulated that no one should refer to him as the Tsar or Emperor in exile or the pretender to the throne. Okay, so today we have 3 new people that we'll be meeting, so 3 men to sort of offset the 4 women from yesterday. One, Eric Freiberg, is a very insignificant person, And the other two actually were important, very important in the Civil War. And one of them indeed would continue to be important in the Nazi movement, although not in its formation. So Grigory Semyonov and Pyotr Krasnov, they were both Atamans, so they were both leaders of Cossack hosts. Semyonov, the Transbaikal Cossack host in the Far East, and Krasnov, the Don Cossacks. So these are genuinely historically important people, although, as I said, not necessarily in the formation of Nazism. They played a peripheral role in that. Okay, so we're up to the 3rd of March, 1921. It's a Thursday. We're in Berlin, and Dmitri is staying at the Hotel Excelsior. And here we go. Masses of people came to see me in the morning. First, Biskupski, who revealed all his plans to me, then Colonel Freiberg. He is a representative of Ataman Semyonov and heaped praises on him. Then Krasnov came. He's aged frightfully and gave me the impression of a man who could not possibly incite the savage Don to feats of glory. Around 12:30, a German from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs came to see me, a certain Blühner, a sly and oily Prussian. I had an interesting conversation with him on the topic of politics and the future of Russia. Naturally, he denies that Bolshevism was imposed on Russia by the Germans. He was frightfully interested in my opinion of what Russia would be like in the future and who her friends would be. Here I declared that I am Russian above all else and not pro-German or pro-Entente, and that anyone who wants to help Russia without seeking to profit from her is her friend. For lunch, I went to a restaurant that serves Russian dishes and ate huge quantities of blini. I had lots of visitors once more in the afternoon, Markov too, Rimsky-Korsakov, and that remarkably nice old man Baransky. Around 6 o'clock, my head was just about bursting, so I went for a walk with Galeevsky, of course. We stopped by the Adlon for a cocktail. I dined at Vera's. I got home around 11 o'clock and had another long conversation with Galeevsky. Okay, this interests me very much, primarily because of this meeting with the official from the Foreign Office of the Weimar government. All right, so let's talk about these three men. Well, Erich Georgievich Freiberg was Dmitri's age, a little older. He was born in 1890 and Dmitri in 1891, and he was an officer who had been sent, so a Cossack officer who had been sent by Semyonov to make contact with the white Russian emigres in Germany. And he, so he was meeting Dmitri specifically as a representative of Semyonov, and I'm very interested in the fact that Semyonov wanted Freiberg to meet Dmitri and to make an assessment of him. So this is actually very interesting. So Semyonov himself, Grigory Mikhailovich, he was the self-declared Ataman of the Transbaikal Cossacks in the Far East, and he was accepted as their leader. He was one of these sort of adventurers / military men who were going to form their own Wild West kind of settlements and governments and resist the Bolsheviks. And he was also very young. He was also Dmitri's age, born in 1890, so only 30 years old. And he was the organizer of the White Russian movement in the Far East, and he established his own little, like I say, his own little government there. He was a very bloody man. He committed all kinds of atrocities. He had been forced to flee to Manchuria in 1920, And in May 1921, he actually went to Japan, and most of his power base was with the Japanese. He was, interestingly, he had a Russian father, but his mother was Buryat, and so this was the ethnicity that was indigenous to this part of the Far East, and Buryat and Mongolian, I think his mother was. So anyway, he was in China in 1920. In May 1921, he went to Japan. Then he returned to Russian territory briefly, but had to flee again to China. And what's interesting about him is that he then became one of the collaborators with the former Chinese Emperor Pu Yi, who set up this, or the Japanese set up this puppet government in Manchuria called Manchukuo. And Pu Yi was the emperor of Manchukuo, and Semyonov was one of the people there in his in his group of advisors, or however you want to put it. Semyonov was then captured by the Soviets in 1945 and executed in 1946. Okay, then we have General Pyotr Nikolaevich Krasnov. So of all of these, he's probably the most significant. Again, he was a Cossack leader, an Ataman of the Don Cossacks, probably the most famous of the Cossack hosts located in Ukraine. He was about 52 years old at the time that he was meeting with Dmitri. Dmitri clearly had met him before, because he remarks that Krasnov has really aged since the last time he saw him. And it's not at all surprising that he knew Krasnov, because Krasnov was an old cavalry officer, and he'd been at the Nikolai Cavalry School as an instructor, which is where Dmitri went. And yeah, he was all over the place with the cavalry in World War I. And so absolutely Dmitri would have known him without any sort of political affiliations. And he was the dictator of an independent Don state after the Bolshevik takeover. He did not, I'm quoting, he did not submit to the authority of General Denikin, who was the leader, one of the top 3 or 4 leaders of the white Russian movement in the Civil War, but instead sought the recognition and support of Germany, which he received. Okay, so that's interesting. So I would highly recommend a book to you. It's a work of fiction, but it's very, very strongly grounded in the actual experience of the author, Mikhail Bulgakov, who's famous for The Master and Margarita. This book is called The White Guard, and it is all about what was happening in Kiev in 1918 and in Ukraine. And Bulgakov, his family, they weren't Ukrainian, but he'd been born and raised in Odessa, in Kiev. And he and his brother, who were fighting with in World War I with the Tsarist forces, they, after the revolution, retreated went back to their home in Kiev. And he describes the just absolute chaos and the literally street-by-street fighting that was going on in Kiev, or Kiev, I should say. That's the Ukrainian pronunciation. And all these different forces. The Germans were withdrawing. They'd been a very strong presence, and they had been fighting with the Cossacks as allies. They were withdrawing. The Reds were just outside the city gates, you could say, waiting to swoop in. And then you had these rearguard white Russian officers and soldiers like the Bulgakov brothers, who felt betrayed by the fact that so many of their fellow white Russians were in league with the Germans, who were now betraying them and withdrawing. And there were also the Ukrainian nationalist forces of Petliura, and the whole thing is a big, is a big mess. But so such things are always a big mess. They're always chaotic. And it's an excellent book, and you'll meet some of these people and, see what that was like. Okay, in fact, all of this reminds me a little bit of the aftermath of the American Civil War, when you had people like the James brothers and other Southern officers, some of them that had been part of the Southern guerrilla forces in the like the James brothers in the border states, and they went west, they went to Texas, they went to Arizona, and so you sort of had this continuation of the Civil War when you had fights like the famous shootout at the OK Corral between the Earp brothers and the Clanton brothers, representing respectively the South and the North. And so this is kind of similar to this that's going on now outside of Russia with these emigres in Germany. Okay, so the interesting thing, and I guess, I wasn't cautious enough. I got the impression from Dmitri that Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich really did not want to take an active part in all this wrangling in between the different factions in exile, and that he certainly never declared himself to be the emperor in exile. But, maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know. I know there's a scholarly biography of Nikolai Nikolaevich out there, and I haven't been able to find it. It probably costs, a couple $100, but if I can find it, I'm going to buy it. If any of you have the reference to that, please let me know, because I don't even have the author's name, although I know he was a professor, I think in Canada. But anyway, I need to read that book so that I can really clear things up on what Nikolai Nikolaevich was doing, what his mindset was. He was not at all hostile to Dmitri. I don't know how seriously he took Dmitri, but as any of you know who watched the January videos, the videos on the January part of the 1921 diaries, he received Dmitri more than once in the south of France. But anyway, apparently, Krasnov, for whatever reason, had worked with Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, and there is some intimation that Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich was involved in these things, and that in the end, Markov decided to back Nikolai Nikolaevich. Biskupsky backed Kirill. Markov backed Nikolai Nikolaevich. And interestingly, I discovered here that Krasnov backed Dmitri. So this is interesting. We have here, I'll quote, talking about Krasnov, he managed to skirt white emigre infighting between Aufbau and Nikolai Markov II's pro-Nikolai Nikolaevich Supreme Monarchical Council, in that he personally favored neither Kirill nor Nikolai Nikolaevich for Tsar. Instead, he advocated the candidacy of Grand Prince Dmitri Romanov, who enjoyed little support among white emigres as a whole. I don't know why he says Grand Prince instead of Great Prince or Grand Duke. The Russian literally is Great Prince. But yeah, he advocated the candidacy of Grand Prince Dmitri Romanov, who enjoyed little support among white emigres as a whole. I would say that initially Dmitri enjoyed a lot of support among white emigres as a whole. I'm sure many had misgivings about his role in the Rasputin assassination, but at any rate, yes, it was waning. And so, of course, the note for this seems to me to be, fairly reliable. It's a report from the Weimar government's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So exactly this man who is coming to visit Dmitri is probably the one compiling this report. And so, you can find it at the Politisches Archiv des Auswärtigen Amtes, the Political Archives of the Foreign Office in Berlin. and it was filed actually by the Staatskommissar für öffentliche Ordnung, State Commissioner for Public Order, and probably compiled by this man that went and met Dmitri in Berlin. So that's very interesting indeed. And I can honestly say I don't know what Krasnov saw in Dmitri, because Krasnov was horrible. Krasnov was a nightmarish human being, and he actually Dmitri, this would just have appalled him. And I think Dmitri was probably, he was alive at the time. That was 41, June 41, wasn't it? When the Germans declared war on Russia, Krasnov immediately, apparently, called upon the Cossacks still in Germany to fight for Hitler. So here's the former Ataman of the Don Host calling upon Cossacks in exile to fight for Hitler. Great, and he's associated with the protocols of the Elders of Zion and all that, extremely nasty, vicious stuff. So maybe he just saw Dmitri as someone who would be pliable. He's young, he's handsome, he's not weighted down with a wife. Someone suitable could be chosen, that sort of thing. But it's very interesting that Dmitri met him, and it's very interesting that Dmitri assesses him as someone who's over the hill, past his prime. He wasn't that old. He was 52, I think. But Dmitri looks at him and says, I can't imagine this guy. He didn't give me the impression of a man who could incite the savage Don to feats of glory. And so, Dmitri wasn't even impressed by him. But for some reason, Krasnov, wanted Dmitri to be the next emperor of Russia. And God only knows why. But I am not going to look at that as a stain upon Dmitri himself, especially since in other parts of the diary as well, Dmitri reacts negatively to Krasnov. Okay, so then we have this issue of this man who came and visited Dmitri, and I think Dmitri probably had no choice about this visit. I think he was, he was told that we want to talk to you. This man from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So usually at this time, when you didn't have independent intelligence agencies, usually the intelligence gatherers were the people attached to the embassies and the diplomatic service. Well, you don't have that when you're in Germany. You don't have, a German embassy in Germany. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs sent this man. My colleagues in Russia think that the name, as Dmitri spells it, is Blüner, but I don't think so. It's you can't say for sure, because the Russian letter N and the letter H, the X-shaped letter, they look too close. But I think it's Blücher, just because Blücher is a name and Blüner, as far as I'm concerned, is not. But I despair of ever, really being able to find anything about this man, whether it's Blüner or Blücher. But, so I do know now that there are these documents in the archive in Berlin. So that could be useful if I manage to make it there. Okay. So Dmitri calls him a sly and oily Prussian. Well, that's interesting, because those are two things that we do not usually associate with Prussians. We see Prussians as being, in the stereotypical view of Prussians, is that they're anything but sly and oily. They are, these sort of blonde, militaristic. It's totally a stereotype. But anyway, Dmitri, I'm sure, felt a little bit threatened by this. He'd had people from the government come and visit him before in France, and in France in 1918 and in London in 1919, and basically had told him to get lost, that he wasn't welcome. But then he seems to have enjoyed the conversation, and he clearly asked this fellow if Bolshevism had been brought to Russia by the Germans, meaning had the Germans really put Lenin, not had the Germans invented Bolshevism, but had the Germans really put the Bolshevik leader Lenin on a train and sent him opportunistically to Russia in the hope that he would succeed in fomenting a revolution, which he did. And the answer to that is yes. They did indeed put Lenin on a train, and that strategy completely backfired on them. But anyway, that's what Dmitri asked him about. He denied it, and he was lying. What more can you say about that? Dmitri, I think, was flattered that the man was interested in my opinion of what Russia would be like in the future and who her friends would be. And of course, he makes this declaration that I think was very sincere, that I am a Russian above all else, not pro-German, not pro-Entente. Anyone who wants to help Russia without seeking to profit from her is her friend. And Dmitri and the young Russians would never be willing to ally with a foreign group, because they did not want any foreign group with its own motives coming into Russia. So yeah, that was something he already felt before he got involved with Young Russia, and I'm sure it was very sincere on his part, but he wanted to make it clear to this representative of the Weimar government that he was not coming to Berlin in order to help this movement to overthrow, this right-wing German movement to overthrow the Weimar government, that he was not partisan politically, that he just saw himself as a faithful Russian. Okay, then he goes off to lunch. He doesn't mention anybody being with him, but this made me laugh, because he writes that he ate huge quantities of blini. And as most of you know, his whole life Dmitri was not only thin, but told by his doctors that he was on the underweight side, until the very end at Chatsop, when he started gaining weight. But at any rate, he wasn't a very strongly food-motivated person. He really never talks about food, except when it's a question of blini. And anytime there's blini, he always says that he, in so many words, that he pigs out, that he eats huge quantities of blini. It probably did him good. But anyway, if any of you ever want to have an occasion for Dmitri's birthday or something like that, then definitely have blini. Okay, so he sees some of the same people from before, and then he says around 6 o'clock, my head was just about bursting. So does this mean that he had one of the headaches that he was so prone to when he was a boy of 14, 15, 16? Or does it mean that it was just too overwhelming trying to take all this stuff in and he needed a break? Well, maybe it means both things. But anyway, he goes for a walk with Golevsky. With Golevsky, of course, he says, I think he would have preferred to take the walk by himself, reading between the lines, but Golevsky again had these security concerns. Okay, and he and Golevsky stop by the Adlon Hotel for a cocktail. Then Dmitri goes out to dinner with Vera, and yeah, that is about it. That is about it. That's a lot. I've gone almost a half an hour. We will continue to see more of Vera Karali, so he went out to dinner with her. That would have been about 7, and then he got back to his hotel at 11. He doesn't tell us what they did, and that is all right. We don't need to know what they did. And so what will we have tomorrow? Tomorrow. A big new cast of characters, a big get-together, lots of new people, some of whom Dmitri knew, some of them he didn't know personally but meets now. and a big formal occasion, evening occasion with a balalaika orchestra, and so on and so forth. We will be leaving in Berlin on the 7th of March. It's now the 3rd of March. Tomorrow, or the next video will be the 4th of March, and then we'll be back to Paris. And I have just a few seconds left until I've gone a half hour, so I'll say goodbye now. See you next time.